The dying man's eyes held secrets that would shatter everything Clara Whitmore believed about enemies and angels. Thunder rolled across the Yorkshire moors like cannon fire, and Clara pressed her face to the rain-streaked window of the cottage infirmary. 3 years into the Great War, she'd grown accustomed to storms. Both the ones that battered the heather outside and the ones that raged in men's souls when they arrived at her door, broken and bleeding. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the very air seemed to whisper of change. "Miss Clara." Young Tommy burst through the door, his cap dripping puddles onto the stone floor. "There's been a crash, an aeroplane, down in Bracken Hollow." Clara's hands stilled on the bandages she'd been rolling. Aircraft rarely ventured this far north, and when they did, ours or theirs. "Can't rightly say, miss. But there's a man alive in the wreckage." "Barely." She was already reaching for her medical bag, the worn leather familiar as her own skin. 3 years of tending to soldiers, British boys mostly, sometimes French, occasionally a stray American, had taught her that nationality mattered little when death came calling. Pain spoke a universal language. The wind tried to steal her breath as they hurried across the moor, Tommy's lantern casting wild shadows through the rain. Clara pulled her woolen cloak tighter, thinking of her brother James, somewhere in the trenches of France. Each time she saved a life, she whispered a prayer that someone, somewhere, might show him the same mercy. The aircraft lay crumpled against the ancient stone wall like a broken bird. One wing had torn away completely, and smoke still rose from the engine despite the rain's efforts. But it was the markings, those distinctive black crosses, that made Clara's blood run cold. "German." "Sweet Mary," Tommy breathed. "It's one of theirs." Clara approached the wreckage with careful steps, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the shattered cockpit glass, she could see him, a young man, unconscious, blood matting his fair hair. His leather jacket bore the unmistakable insignia of the Imperial German Air Service, the enemy. The faceless monsters her government warned her about in propaganda posters. The killers who dropped bombs on innocent villages and machine-gunned refugee columns. Yet as she drew closer, all she could see was how young he looked. Barely older than James. "We should alert the authorities," Tommy whispered, but his voice carried doubt. The nearest military post was 20 miles away, and the roads had washed out in yesterday's deluge. By the time help arrived, Clara made her choice. "Help me get him out. Miss Clara, he's dying." She was already working to free him from the twisted metal, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "I took an oath, Tommy. All life is sacred." Together, they managed to extract the pilot from his steel coffin. He was unconscious but breathing, though each breath seemed to cost him tremendous effort. A deep gash ran from his temple to his jaw, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. Worse, she could see the telltale flush of fever already beginning to color his pale cheeks. As they carried him back to the cottage, Clara found herself studying his face in the lantern light. Strong jaw, high cheekbones, and surprisingly long eyelashes that cast shadows on his cheeks. Nothing about him looked monstrous. Nothing about him looked like the caricatures in the newspapers. He looked like someone's son. Someone's brother. Back in the infirmary, Clara worked through the night. She cleaned and stitched his wounds with the same gentle care she'd shown countless Allied soldiers. She set his broken arm and monitored his fever, spooning water between his cracked lips when he showed signs of delirium. WWII dawn. The storm had passed, but the one in Clara's heart was just beginning. She sat beside his bed, exhaustion weighing her shoulders like lead. What was she doing? Harboring an enemy pilot was treason. If discovered, she could face imprisonment, even execution. Yet every time she looked at his peaceful face, she saw not a monster, but a man barely out of boyhood, far from home and perhaps as frightened as any of the British lads she'd tended. As if sensing her gaze, his eyes fluttered open. They were the deepest blue she'd ever seen, like the ocean on a clear summer day. For a moment, they held nothing but confusion and pain. Then awareness crept in, and she saw the exact moment he realized where he was and what she was. English. The enemy. His hand moved instinctively toward where his sidearm would have been, but found only bandages and empty air. Clara remained perfectly still, letting him assess his situation. She could see the calculations running behind those remarkable eyes, wounded, weaponless, at the mercy of his foe. "You saved me," he said finally, his English accented but clear. His voice was rough from smoke and injury, but carried an unexpected gentleness. "I'm a nurse," Clara replied simply. "It's what I do, even for the enemy." The question hung between them like morning mist, full of dangers neither dared to name. Clara thought of James, of all the British boys who would never come home, of the villages that lay in ruins because of men like this one. But she also thought of the Hippocratic Oath, of her duty to heal regardless of uniform or flag. Most of all, she thought of how peaceful he'd looked in sleep, how young and vulnerable and achingly human. "Especially for the enemy," she whispered. Something shifted in his eyes then. Surprise, perhaps, or the first fragile seeds of something that might, in time, grow into trust. But before either could speak again, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the moor. Clara's blood turned to ice. Through the window, she could see the unmistakable silhouettes of British cavalry, their Union Jack banners snapping in the morning breeze. The pilot heard them too. Their eyes met and held, and in that moment, Clara realized she faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. Turn him in and watch him hang as a spy and saboteur, or hide him and become a traitor to everything she'd been raised to believe. The hoofbeats grew louder, and time was running out, but Clara's mind raced faster than her heartbeat. The cavalry would reach the cottage within minutes, and every second of hesitation could mean death for both of them. "Can you walk?" she whispered urgently. The German pilot struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through his injured body. I think so." The root cellar, behind the kitchen. Clara was already moving, gathering his bloodied clothes and personal effects. Among them, she found his identification papers and a small leather journal filled with sketches, not of military installations or strategic targets, but of birds in flight, wildflowers, and what looked like a young woman's portrait. Their eyes met again as she helped him to his feet. He swayed dangerously, and she caught him, feeling the fever heat radiating from his skin. This close, she could smell the smoke still clinging to his hair, see the exhaustion carved into every line of his face. "Why?" he asked, leaning heavily on her shoulder as they made their way toward the kitchen. "Why risk everything for someone like me?" Clara didn't answer immediately. How could she explain that in his fevered sleep, he'd cried out in German, not orders or threats, but a woman's name, spoken with such heartbreak that it had made her own eyes fill with tears? How could she tell him that when she looked at him, she saw not the enemy, but simply another soul lost in this terrible war? "Because," she said finally, helping him down the narrow stairs into the root cellar, "someone has to choose mercy." The cellar was cramped and cold, filled with preserves and winter vegetables. Clara arranged some old blankets in the corner, creating a makeshift bed among the potato sacks. The space smelled of earth and herbs, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic cleanliness of the infirmary above. "Stay quiet, no matter what you hear," she warned, pressing a water bottle and some bread into his hands. "If they search the house, you could tell them I forced you." His blue eyes were serious, intense. "Say I threatened you, made you treat my wounds. They would believe it." Clara shook her head. "I won't lie about why I saved you." "Then you're either very brave or very foolish. Perhaps both." She managed a wan smile. "What's your name? If I'm to be hanged for treason, I'd like to know who I'm dying for." He hesitated, then, "Eric. Eric Zimmerman. Clara Whitmore." She paused at the cellar door. "Try to rest, Eric Zimmerman. This isn't over yet." Above ground, Clara quickly changed from her blood-stained dress into a clean one, braided her hair, and splashed cold water on her face to hide the evidence of her sleepless night. When the cavalry reached her door, she was sitting calmly at her kitchen table, mending a torn sheet as if nothing in the world had changed. "Miss Whitmore." The captain who entered was young, probably fresh from training, with kind eyes and a nervous demeanor. Behind him, 3 soldiers waited on horseback. "Captain Hartwell, His Majesty's 12th Light Horse. We've had reports of an aircraft crash in the area." "Yes, I heard the thunder last night. Terrible storm." Clara kept her needle moving steadily, her voice carefully neutral. "Found wreckage this morning, about a mile north of here. Any survivors?" "None that I could see. The crash site was quite extensive. I didn't venture too close, still smoldering when I passed by." Captain Hartwell studied her face with sharp eyes. Clara had the uncomfortable feeling he saw more than she wanted him to. We'll need to examine the wreckage, of course. And I'm afraid we'll have to search your property as well. Standard procedure when enemy aircraft are involved. Clara's hand stilled for just a moment on her needle. Enemy aircraft? German reconnaissance plane, by the look of the markings. Intelligence suggests they've been mapping our northern defenses. He stepped closer, and Clara caught the scent of horse leather and gun oil. You understand our concern, Miss Whitmore. If any German personnel survived, of course. Clara rose gracefully, setting aside her mending. Please, search wherever you need to. I've nothing to hide. The next 20 minutes were the longest of Clara's life. She watched with studied calm as the soldiers methodically went through her cottage, the parlor, the bedrooms, even the infirmary. Captain Hartwell lingered there longest, examining the medical supplies, the freshly laundered linens, the faint traces of blood she hadn't quite managed to scrub from the wooden floor. You've been busy, he observed. A farmer's boy from the next dale overtook a nasty fall yesterday. Brought him in for stitching. The lie came easier than she'd expected. Young men and their reckless ways, you know. Indeed. But his eyes remained sharp, searching. When they reached the kitchen, Clara's heart nearly stopped. One of the soldiers was standing directly above the cellar door, his boots planted on the worn wooden planks. Below, Eric lay hidden in the darkness, and Clara found herself holding her breath, willing him to remain silent. What's down there? The soldier asked, noticing the door's outline. Root cellar. Nothing but turnips and preserves, I'm afraid. Clara moved to open it, hoping her hands weren't shaking visibly. Please, look for yourself if you wish. The soldier lifted the door and peered down into the darkness. Clara's pulse thundered so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. One glance, one sound, one moment of bad luck, dark as a tomb down there. The soldier muttered, dropping the door closed again. Doubt anyone could hide in that mess. Clara nearly wept with relief. After what felt like hours, the search concluded. Captain Hartwell stood in her doorway, clearly unsatisfied but unable to articulate why. If you see anything suspicious, Miss Whitmore, anything at all, you'll contact us immediately? Of course, Captain. Good. He touched his cap in a brief salute. And Miss Whitmore, be careful. There are dangerous men abroad in times like these. Not everyone can be trusted. The words sent a chill down Clara's spine, but she managed to keep her voice steady. I'll bear that in mind. She watched from her window as the cavalry rode away, not daring to move until they disappeared completely over the hill. Only then did she rush to the cellar, her legs shaking with delayed reaction. Eric was exactly where she'd left him, but his fever had worsened. His face was flushed, and he was muttering in German, lost in delirium. Clara felt his forehead, burning hot, and knew they were far from safe. The soldiers? He managed to ask during a moment of clarity. Gone. For now. Clara helped him back up to the infirmary, supporting his weight as he stumbled. But they'll be back. And next time, they might not be so easily satisfied. As she settled him back into the bed, checking his bandages and preparing fever-reducing herbs, Eric caught her hand. Why didn't you turn me in? His voice was weak but intense. You could have ended this. Been safe. Clara looked down at their joined hands, his calloused from gripping aircraft controls, hers soft from years of healing touch. Enemy and ally, German and English, man and woman. Yet in that moment, all she could feel was the shared humanity that connected them. Because, she said softly, this war has taken enough good men already. I won't help it take one more. Outside, storm clouds were gathering again, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the real tempest was yet to come for 3 days. Eric drifted between fever and consciousness, while Clara tended him with the devotion of a saint nursing a miracle. She barely slept, taking only brief moments to rest in the chair beside his bed, starting awake at every sound that might herald the return of British soldiers. During his lucid moments, they spoke in whispers, careful conversations that danced around the war raging beyond her cottage walls. She learned that he was 24, a pilot from Bavaria whose family grew hops for the local brewery. He'd studied literature before the war, dreamed of becoming a teacher. The sketches in his journal, he explained with a shy smile, were letters to his sister Anna, a girl too young to read but old enough to love pictures of the world beyond their village. And the woman's portrait? Clara asked one evening as she changed his bandages, trying to keep her tone casual. Eric's expression softened. Greta, we were to be married before I was called up. His voice carried such longing that Clara felt her chest tighten unexpectedly. She promised to wait, but that was 2 years ago. War changes everything, doesn't it? Clara's hands stilled on the fresh bandages. Yes, she whispered. It certainly does. On the fourth morning, Eric's fever finally broke. Clara woke to find him sitting up in bed, his blue eyes clear and focused for the first time since the crash. Sunlight streamed through the cottage windows, painting everything in shades of gold, and for a moment the war seemed very far away. Good morning, he said softly, and Clara realized with a start that she'd grown accustomed to his voice, to his presence in her peaceful sanctuary. Good morning. She busied herself with unnecessary tasks, suddenly aware of how intimate their situation had become. For days, she'd been his entire world, nurse, protector, confidant. The realization left her feeling strangely vulnerable. How do you feel? Like I've been trampled by a horse and shot from a cannon. Eric managed a weak smile. But alive, thanks to you. He paused, studying her face. You look exhausted. When did you last sleep properly? I'm fine. But even as she said it, Clara felt the accumulated weight of fear and sleepless nights pressing down on her shoulders. She'd been running on determination and prayer, but now that the immediate crisis had passed, exhaustion crashed over her like a tide. Eric noticed her sway slightly and was immediately alert. Clara, you need to rest. I can't. If someone comes, then I'll watch. His voice was firm despite his weakness. You've spent days caring for me. Let me return the favor, even in this small way. Their eyes met and held, and Clara felt something shift between them, a recognition that went deeper than gratitude or duty. She saw herself reflected in his gaze, not just the efficient nurse or the proper English lady, but the woman who'd chosen compassion over safety, mercy over fear, against her better judgment. She allowed herself to lie down on the small cot she'd set up across the room. Eric's voice, soft and melodic, followed her into sleep as he began to recite German poetry, something about starlight and hope that sounded beautiful even though she couldn't understand the words. Clara woke to the sound of voices outside her cottage. She sat up quickly, her heart immediately racing, but Eric's calm gesture reassured her. He was standing by the window, still weak but alert, and his expression was puzzled rather than alarmed. Local farmers, he reported quietly. They seem distressed about something. Clara joined him at the window and saw her neighbor, Mr. Ashford, speaking animatedly with 2 other men from the village. Their faces were grim, and she caught fragments of their conversation drifting through the glass. Attack the supply convoy. 3 of our boys dead. Bloody German murderers. Clara's blood ran cold. She'd been so focused on Eric's recovery that she'd forgotten the war was still raging beyond her small sanctuary. Now reality came crashing back with brutal force. I should go see what's happened, she murmured, but Eric caught her arm gently. Clara. His voice was grave. If there's been an attack, if British soldiers have been killed, they'll be looking for revenge, for someone to blame. She met his eyes and saw her own fear reflected there. They both understood what this meant. Any German found in the area now would face not just imprisonment, but likely a summary execution. The rules of civilized warfare became fluid when grief and anger took control. You have to leave, Clara said, the words tearing at her heart even as she spoke them. Tonight, as soon as it's dark, I'll give you civilian clothes, some food, and go where? Eric's smile was sad, but not bitter. I'm a German pilot 50 miles behind enemy lines, barely able to walk. Even if I could reach the coast, the channel might as well be an ocean. Clara stared at him, realizing the impossible situation they faced. Keeping him here meant inevitable discovery and death for them both. Sending him away meant watching him walk toward almost certain capture and execution. There might be another way, she said slowly, an idea forming. But you won't like it. Before Eric could respond, heavy footsteps approached the cottage door. Clara's blood froze as she recognized the authoritative knock. Not a neighbor seeking medical help, but official business. Miss Whitmore. Captain Hartwell's voice carried through the wooden door. We need to speak with you immediately. Clara and Eric stared at each other, both understanding that this moment would define everything that came after. There was no time for lengthy explanations or careful plans. She had perhaps 30 seconds to make a choice that would determine whether they lived or died. The cellar, she whispered, but Eric shook his head. No more hiding. If they search properly this time. He straightened as much as his injuries allowed, and Clara saw a flash of the proud Bavarian pilot beneath the wounded man she'd been nursing. There's something I need to tell you. Something. That changes everything. Miss Whitmore. The knocking grew more insistent. What are you talking about? Clara hissed. Even as she moved toward the door, Eric's blue eyes were intense, burning with urgency. I wasn't on a reconnaissance mission. When I crashed, I was trying to defect. Clara stopped dead, her hand frozen on the door latch. What? I have information, troop movements, supply routes, strategic plans. I was flying to Scotland to surrender to British intelligence when the storm brought me down. His voice was rapid, desperate. Clara, I'm not your enemy. I haven't been for months. The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. Everything she'd assumed, every moment of guilt and fear about harboring a German spy, every internal battle between duty and compassion, all of it based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Miss Whitmore. Captain Hartwell's voice carried a new edge of impatience. We know you're in there. Clara's mind reeled. If Eric was telling the truth, then he wasn't a prisoner of war at all, but a potential ally. Someone trying to end the war, not prolong it. Someone who'd risked everything to bring valuable intelligence to the British forces. But if he was lying, she looked into his eyes one more time, searching for deception and finding only desperate honesty. In that instant, Clara made her choice, not based on logic or strategy, but on the connection that had been growing between them over these past few days. She chose to trust. Stay here, she whispered. And Eric, if you're lying to me, I'm not. His voice carried absolute conviction. I swear on my sister's life, Clara, I'm not your enemy. Clara straightened her dress, smoothed her hair, and opened the door to face whatever came next. Captain Hartwell stood on her threshold with 4 soldiers behind him, their faces grim with purpose and barely contained anger. Captain, Clara said calmly, what brings you back so soon? We've had developments, Miss Whitmore. Developments that change everything. Captain Hartwell stepped into Clara's cottage without invitation, his eyes scanning the room with predatory intensity. The soldiers behind him remained outside, but Clara could see their hands resting on their weapons, their faces hard with the kind of anger that came after watching friends die. 3 of our supply wagons were attacked yesterday evening, Hartwell began, his voice clipped and professional. Ambushed on the road to Whitby. 7 men dead, including Private Morrison, barely 18 years old. Clara's heart sank. She'd known young Morrison, had treated him for pneumonia the previous winter. A sweet boy who wrote letters to his mother every week and talked endlessly about the girl he planned to marry when the war ended. I'm sorry for your loss, Captain, she said quietly, and meant it. The attack was precise, coordinated. Someone with detailed knowledge of our supply routes and timing. Hartwell moved closer, his gaze never leaving her face. Someone who knew exactly where our boys would be vulnerable. The implication hung heavy in the air. Clara felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the morning chill. Surely you don't think I think, Hartwell interrupted, that it's remarkably convenient how a German reconnaissance aircraft crashes practically on your doorstep just days before our men are slaughtered. I think it's suspicious that you, a woman living alone in the perfect position to observe our military movements, have shown no curiosity about investigating that crash site more thoroughly. Clara's mouth went dry. Every word was leading toward an accusation that would see her hanged as a spy. But behind Hartwell's logic lay a fundamental error. Eric hadn't been gathering intelligence for an attack. He'd been trying to prevent them. Captain, I understand your grief is making you see conspiracies where grief? Hartwell's control finally cracked, and Clara saw the raw pain beneath his professional facade. Morrison was my cousin, Miss Whitmore. That boy called me Uncle Jeffrey and asked me to teach him to ride when he was 6 years old. So yes, grief is making me very thorough in my investigation. The cottage suddenly felt airless, thick with tension and barely suppressed. Violence. Clara realized that Hartwell hadn't come here seeking information. He'd come seeking vengeance. and she was the most convenient target. From the infirmary came a soft sound, barely audible, but enough to make Hartwell's head snap toward the doorway. Clara's blood turned to ice. What was that? The wind, perhaps. These old cottages. But Hartwell was already moving, his hand on his sidearm. Clara rushed after him, her mind racing through possibilities and finding none that didn't end in disaster. The infirmary appeared empty at first glance. The bed where Eric had been resting was vacant, the blankets smooth and undisturbed. Clara's heart hammered as Hartwell methodically examined the room, checking behind furniture, testing floorboards for hidden spaces. Where is he? Hartwell's voice was deadly quiet. I don't know what you mean. The bloodstains, Miss Whitmore. He pointed to the floor where Clara had thought she'd cleaned away all evidence. Fresh medical supplies used recently. Someone was treated here, and recently. His eyes fixed on hers with laser intensity. Someone who bled considerably. Clara opened her mouth to repeat her story about the injured farm boy, but the words died in her throat. Hartwell's expression told her he'd already investigated that lie and found it wanting. You have one chance to tell me the truth, he said, his hand now openly resting on his pistol grip. Where is the German pilot? The moment stretched like a violin string under too much tension. Clara could feel her life balancing on a knife's edge, could almost see the gallows that awaited her if she made the wrong choice. But louder than her fear was the memory of Eric's voice. I swear on my sister's life, Clara, I'm not your enemy. He's here, she said quietly. Hartwell's eyes flashed with triumph and fury. Where? But Captain, you need to understand. Where? Before Clara could answer, Eric appeared in the doorway. He'd managed to find and don one of her late father's old shirts, though it hung loose on his wounded frame. His face was pale but determined, and he carried himself with the dignity of a man facing his executioner. I'm here, he said simply. The room exploded into motion. Hartwell's pistol cleared its holster faster than Clara could follow, and two of his soldiers rushed through the door with rifles raised. Eric didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood with his hands visible and empty. Eric Zimmerman, he said before anyone could speak. Lieutenant, Imperial German Air Service. Serial number 4471A. You bastard, Hartwell snarled. You murdering I didn't kill your men. The simple statement cut through Hartwell's rage like a blade. Eric's blue eyes were steady, unflinching even with 3 weapons pointed at his chest. I was carrying intelligence to your command when my aircraft was forced down. Critical information about German troop movements and planned attacks. Eric's voice grew stronger, more authoritative. Information that could have prevented yesterday's ambush if I'd been able to deliver it in time. Hartwell's pistol never wavered, but Clara saw doubt flicker across his features. You expect me to believe that? Check my aircraft. In the cockpit, sealed in an oilskin pouch behind the instrument panel. Maps, coded documents, troop disposition reports. Eric's gaze shifted to Clara for just a moment, and she saw apology and gratitude warring in his expression. Miss Whitmore saved my life, but she had no knowledge of my mission. I let her believe I was simply a wounded enemy because I needed time to decide if I could trust her. Trust her with what? Hartwell demanded. Eric straightened despite his obvious pain. With the location of a planned attack on Scarborough. Coordinated assault, sea and land forces. Scheduled for tomorrow night, when your garrison is reduced for the monthly supply run to York. The color drained from Hartwell's face. That's classified information. No German should know. I know because I helped plan it. Eric's voice was flat, matter of fact. Before I realized that this war is destroying everything decent in the world. Before I decided that some things matter more than flags and uniforms. Clara watched the transformation on Hartwell's face as the implications sank in. If Eric was telling the truth, and the specific details suggested he was, then his intelligence could save hundreds of lives. But if he was lying, if this was an elaborate deception, sir, one of the soldiers said quietly, perhaps we should verify. I know what we should do, Hartwell snapped, but his pistol had lowered slightly. The question is whether we can trust a word this man says. You can trust me, Eric said simply, because I've already risked everything to get this information to you. Because I crashed trying to reach Scottish command. Because his eyes found Clara's again, and something passed between them that made her breath catch. Because Miss Whitmore trusted me when she had every reason not to. And that trust changed something fundamental in my understanding of what honor truly means. The silence stretched taut. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, could smell the gun oil and leather and fear that filled the small room. Everything hung on Hartwell's next decision. Sir, the soldier spoke again, more urgently this time. Rider approaching fast. Through the window, Clara could see a lone horseman racing toward the cottage, his mount lathered with sweat. Even at a distance, she could tell the news he carried was urgent. The rider dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, stumbling slightly as he ran toward the cottage. Captain Hartwell. Priority message from command. Hartwell holstered his weapon but kept his eyes on Eric. Report. German submarines spotted off Scarborough, sir. Intelligence suggests a coordinated attack. Planned for tomorrow evening. Command is requesting immediate confirmation of any relevant intelligence sources. The cottage fell completely silent except for the rider's labored breathing. Clara felt the world shifting around her like sand in an hourglass, old certainties crumbling as new realities took shape. Hartwell stared at Eric with an expression of dawning recognition. You knew. You actually knew. I helped plan the submarine coordination, Eric confirmed quietly. The attack is real, Captain, and it will succeed unless your forces are prepared. Clara watched as Hartwell's worldview visibly rearranged itself. The German pilot he'd come to arrest as a spy was instead offering to save British lives. The woman he'd suspected of treason had actually been harboring a potential ally. The clear lines between enemy and friend, guilt and innocence, had blurred beyond recognition. The documents, Hartwell said finally. You said they're in your aircraft. Hidden in the cockpit, yes. But Captain, Eric's voice grew urgent. The attack includes land forces as well. A diversionary assault on the coastal road to draw your reserves away from the main target. If you only prepare for the naval attack, how do I know this isn't just an elaborate trap? Hartwell's hand moved toward his weapon again. How do I know you're not feeding us false information to ensure the attack succeeds? Eric looked at Clara, then back at Hartwell. Because, Captain, I'm trusting you with my life by telling you this. If I'm lying, you'll discover it tomorrow, and I'll face a firing squad. If I'm telling the truth. He paused, his blue eyes reflecting something that might have been hope. If I'm telling the truth, perhaps there's still a chance for some good to come from this terrible war. Clara found herself holding her breath as Hartwell weighed the decision that would determine all their fates. Outside, storm clouds were gathering once again, and in the distance, thunder rolled like artillery fire across the Yorkshire moors. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of frantic activity that would reshape Clara's quiet world forever. Captain Hartwell dispatched his fastest riders to verify Eric's intelligence while keeping him under guard at the cottage. The documents, recovered from the crashed aircraft, proved genuine, detailed plans that confirmed every aspect of the intended attack on Scarborough. By afternoon, British forces were repositioning along the coast, preparing for a battle that would have caught them completely off guard without Eric's warning. Clara found herself in the surreal position of serving tea to the German pilot who'd become an unlikely ally and the British captain who'd nearly executed him hours earlier. The three of them sat around her kitchen table like old friends planning a summer outing, rather than potential enemies plotting to prevent a massacre. The diversionary force will approach from Whitby Road just after sunset, Eric explained, pointing to a rough map Hartwell had sketched. 40 men, maybe 50. Their job is to make enough noise to draw your garrison south, while the main assault comes from the sea. Hartwell studied the map with growing respect for his former prisoner's tactical knowledge. And you're certain about the timing? As certain as one can be in war. Eric's smile was wry. Though I suspect my former commanders are regretting their decision to trust me with such detailed information. Why did you decide to defect? Clara asked quietly. It was the question that had haunted her since his revelation, though she hadn't found the courage to ask it until now. Eric was silent for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his teacup. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. I was sent on a reconnaissance mission over a French village last spring. Nothing strategic about it, just a cluster of houses around a small church. But as I flew over, I saw children playing in the square below. They looked up and waved at my aircraft, not knowing it carried death. He paused, his blue eyes distant. With memory, I could have dropped my bombs and completed the mission. Instead, I flew home and told my commanders the target was obscured by clouds. Clara felt her heart clench at the pain in his voice. That night, I wrote a letter to Greta, my fiancée. I told her about the children, about how their innocent faces had made me question everything I thought I believed about duty and honor. Her response changed my life. Eric reached into his pocket and withdrew a worn envelope. With Hartwell's permission, he extracted a single sheet of paper covered in careful German script. She wrote that the man she loved would never harm innocent children, regardless of which uniform he wore. She said she would rather mourn a defector than marry a murderer. His voice cracked slightly. She gave me permission to follow my conscience, even if it meant she might never see me again. Clara found herself blinking back tears. The love in that letter, the courage it must have taken for a young German woman to encourage her beloved to betray his own country, spoke to something profound about the human capacity for growth and moral choice. That's when you decided to approach British intelligence? Hartwell asked, his professional curiosity overriding personal sentiment. It took months to plan. I had to be careful, had to gather enough valuable information to make my defection worthwhile for your forces. But yes, that letter was the beginning. Eric folded the paper carefully and returned it to his pocket. Some things are more important than nationalism, Captain. Love, honor, the protection of innocent life. These transcend the artificial boundaries we draw on maps. As if summoned by his words, a new commotion arose outside the cottage. This time, however, the approaching riders bore news of victory rather than crisis. The attack on Scarborough had been thoroughly thwarted, the German forces retreating in confusion after encountering prepared defenses where they'd expected surprise. Preliminary reports suggest minimal British casualties, the messenger announced. Breathlessly, the submarine was driven off by coastal artillery, and the land forces withdrew after encountering our repositioned infantry. Intelligence estimates we prevented what could have been hundreds of deaths. Clara watched Eric's face as the news sank in. Relief, vindication, and something that might have been peace flickered across his features. He'd risked everything on a single throw of the dice, betting his life that mercy and truth would triumph over hatred and deception. Now that gamble had paid off and lives saved, and a war made slightly less terrible. Captain Hartwell rose from the table, his expression transformed from suspicion to something approaching admiration. Herr Zimmermann, I owe you an apology. And Britain owes you a debt that will be difficult to repay. I require no payment, Captain, only the knowledge that some good has come from so much suffering. Nevertheless, there will be questions about your status. The authorities will want to debrief you, formally process your defection. Hartwell paused, then continued more quietly. They'll also want to know about Miss Whitmore's role in harboring you before your identity was confirmed. Clara felt a chill of renewed fear. Even though Eric's defection had been genuine, her decision to hide him had still technically constituted treason. If the military chose to make an example, Miss Whitmore acted purely on humanitarian grounds, Eric said firmly. She had no knowledge of my mission or intentions. If anyone questions her actions, they should know that her compassion quite possibly saved this operation from failure. I'll make that clear in my report, Hartwell promised, though I suspect there will still be complications. As evening approached and the immediate crisis passed, Clara found herself alone with Eric for the first time since Hartwell's arrival. The captain had withdrawn to coordinate with his superiors, leaving them to contemplate an uncertain future. They walked together to the cottage garden, where Clara's roses were finally beginning to bloom despite the harsh Yorkshire spring. The air was soft with the promise of summer, and for a moment it seemed possible to forget the war raging beyond there. Temporary sanctuary. What happens now? Clara asked, settling beside Eric on the stone bench her father had built years ago. I honestly don't know. Eric's admission was quietly honest. I'm a man without a country now, too German for the British, too much a traitor for the Germans. Perhaps they'll find some use for me in their intelligence services. Perhaps they'll simply relocate me somewhere far from the fighting. And Greta? Eric's smile was sad, but not bitter. Greta is lost to me forever, I think. Even if I survive this war, even if Germany eventually accepts that some of us chose conscience over country, too much has changed. She'll marry someone else, build a life without the complications I represent. He turned to look at Clara, his blue eyes serious. But perhaps that's not entirely a tragedy. Clara felt her breath catch at the implication in his words. Over the past week, as she'd nursed him back to health and watched him struggle with impossible moral choices, something had grown between them that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. Something that felt like the beginning of love, if she dared to name it. Clara, Eric said softly, you saved my life in more ways than you know. Not just from death, but from becoming someone I couldn't bear to be. Your trust, your compassion, they reminded me what it means to be human in the midst of inhuman circumstances. You saved lives too, Clara replied. Hundreds of them, because you chose to do what was right instead of what was expected. They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear overhead, each lost in contemplation of a future that remained unwritten. The war would continue, would claim more lives and shatter more dreams before it ended. But here, in this small garden where roses bloomed despite the darkness, hope felt possible. Whatever happens, Eric said finally, whatever the authorities decide about my fate or yours, I want you to know that these days with you have been the first time in years that I've felt truly alive. Clara reached for his hand, feeling the calluses from aircraft controls and the warmth of skin that had somehow become precious to her. Then we'll face whatever comes together. War may have brought you to my door, but what grows between us has nothing to do with uniforms or flags. Above them, the same stars that had witnessed so much human folly now looked down on a German pilot and an English nurse who'd chosen love over fear, mercy over vengeance, hope over despair. In a world gone mad with violence, they'd found something worth preserving. And in the morning, whatever challenges awaited, they would meet them as they'd met everything else, with courage, compassion, and the revolutionary belief that some things are more important than the artificial boundaries drawn. By WWII in Clara's garden, the roses continued to bloom, their petals soft as promises in the starlight. Love, it seemed, could flourish even in the darkest of times, perhaps especially then, when the need for beauty and connection burned brightest against the shadows of a world at war. If this story of courage choosing love over fear has moved your heart, do share your thoughts below. And pray, subscribe for more tales of souls who dared to see humanity in their supposed enemies. For in these dark times, such stories remind us that hope, like Clara's roses, can bloom in the most unlikely soil.